I never thought my uncle would leave me alone in the middle of nowhere. It was supposed to be a simple camping trip. My uncle, let's call him Greg, was the kind of man who never settled in one place. He always had a new plan, a new idea, something that kept him on the move. My dad used to call him a drifter. He'd pop in and out of our lives, never staying long. But he always had stories, wild stories about things he'd seen in the woods, on the road, in small towns nobody had ever heard of. I was 18 when he showed up again, his old truck rattling into our driveway. He had that look in his eyes, the one that meant he was up to something. He told me he had a place, deep in the woods, that he wanted to show me, a real off-the-grid kind of spot. I was young and stupid. I liked the idea of getting away for a while, doing something different. We drove out early the next morning. The drive was long, and the roads got worse the farther we went. Paved roads turned to gravel, then to dirt. The trees thickened, swallowing the sky, blocking out the sun. It felt like we were heading into another world. By the time we reached the campsite, the sun was starting to set. It wasn't a normal campsite with numbered lots and fire pits. It was just a clearing, surrounded by trees so tall they felt like walls. There was no sign of other people, no sounds except the wind in the branches. The place felt old, untouched. Uncle Greg acted like it was the best place on earth. He set up a small fire, pulled out a few old camping supplies, and started talking about survival skills. How to track animals, how to find your way without a compass, how to start a fire with just a knife and some dry bark. I listened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something felt wrong. Maybe it was the quiet, too quiet, the kind of silence that makes you feel like you're being watched. That night, I had trouble sleeping. The tent felt too thin, the darkness too deep. I kept hearing things, small rustlings in the undergrowth, the snap of a twig. Maybe just animals, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there, watching. By morning, I was exhausted. Greg was already up, boiling water over the fire. He was acting strange, restless, said he was going to check something down by the creek. I asked if I should come, but he waved me off. "Stay here," he said. "I'll be back in a bit." He never came back. At first, I wasn't worried. Maybe he was hunting or just taking his time. But as the hours passed, the sun climbing higher, that uneasy feeling from the night before settled in deep. I waited. By late afternoon, I started walking toward the creek. It wasn't far, but when I got there, I found nothing. No footprints, no sign that he had ever been there. Just the slow-moving water, the trees, the silence. I called his name. Nothing. I walked farther, searching, but the woods all looked the same. I hadn't brought my phone. No service out here anyway. The truck keys were gone. I checked our campsite again, hoping maybe he had come back while I was gone. But his pack was missing. His sleeping bag, like he had just packed up and left. Panic started creeping in. I was miles from anything, deep in a part of the woods I didn't know. I had no way to call for help. No map, no compass. I was alone. At first, I told myself he'd come back. Maybe he had gone to get something and lost track of time. Maybe he'd found a better spot and was waiting for me to find him. I forced myself to stay calm. I collected firewood, made sure the fire stayed lit. But when night came, the fear really set in. The noises started again. Twigs snapping, something moving just beyond the light of the fire. I sat up, gripping the hunting knife Greg had left behind. The darkness felt alive. I couldn't see anything, but I could feel it. Something was out there. I didn't sleep. By morning, I had to face the truth. Greg wasn't coming back. I didn't know if he had abandoned me on purpose or if something had happened to him. Either way, I had two choices. Stay at the campsite and hope someone found me, or try to find my way back to civilization. I chose the second option. I packed what little I had, some jerky, a water bottle, the knife. I didn't know which way to go. The truck had come in from the east, but the trees were so thick I couldn't tell which way was which. I tried to follow the creek, hoping it would lead me to a road. The first few hours were fine, but as the sun climbed, I started feeling like I was going in circles. The woods all looked the same. The trees pressed in on me, thick and endless. The ground sloped in ways I hadn't noticed before. And then I found the first thing that made my stomach drop. Footprint. Fresh. Too big to be mine. I wasn't alone. I stopped, listening. Nothing but the wind. But that feeling, that crawling feeling on the back of my neck, it was stronger now. I kept moving, faster. Then I found something worse. A rope, hanging from a tree, swaying slightly. The knot was old, weathered, but the meaning was clear. Somebody had been here before. I didn't stick around. I moved fast, too fast. My foot caught on a root, and I went down hard, scraping my hands and knees. When I looked up, I saw something that made my blood turn to ice. Another footprint, closer this time. I ran. I don't know how long I ran, but eventually, I found something that saved me. A dirt road. Just a thin, overgrown path, but a road nonetheless. I followed it. Hours later, I found an old cabin, boarded up, falling apart. But it was shelter. I checked the door. Locked. I circled it, looking for anything useful. And then I heard it. Movement. Something was in the trees. Not an animal. Footsteps. I pressed myself against the wall, heart hammering. A man stepped out of the trees. Not Greg. He was tall, thin, wearing clothes that looked worn and dirty. He stared at me, unblinking. He didn't say a word. I didn't wait. I bolted, running back toward the road. I heard him move behind me, but I didn't look back. I ran until my legs felt like they would give out. Then I saw headlights. A truck. I stumbled into the road, waving my arms. The truck skidded to a stop. An older man behind the wheel looked at me, startled. I didn't have the breath to explain. I just pointed behind me, but when I looked back, the man from the woods was gone. The driver took me to the nearest town. I called my parents. Greg was never found. The police searched, but they never found a body. No sign of him, no sign of the truck. Like he had never been there at all. I don't know if he left me on purpose or if something took him. But I do know one thing. I wasn't alone in those woods. I had been looking forward to that camping trip for weeks. Work had been wearing me down, and I just needed some time alone in the woods to clear my head. I wasn't an expert outdoorsman or anything, but I had gone on enough solo trips to know how to handle myself. I picked a spot I had been to once before, about 4 hours from my town, tucked deep into the woods near a small lake. The last time I had been there, it was peaceful and I had barely seen a soul. I packed light but brought everything I needed: tent, sleeping bag, plenty of food, and my old hunting knife. I didn't plan on hunting, but I always carried it just in case. My plan was simple: hike in, set up camp by the lake, spend a couple of nights out there, then hike back. Nothing complicated. The drive out was easy. I turned off the main road onto an old dirt path that led to the trailhead. My truck was the only vehicle in the small parking area, which was exactly what I wanted. Just me and the wilderness. I strapped on my backpack and started walking. The trail was mostly overgrown, but I liked that. It meant fewer people used it. The hike took a couple of hours, but the weather was perfect. The sun was high, the air crisp, birds chirped from the trees, and a light breeze rustled the leaves. It was exactly what I needed. I reached the lake by mid-afternoon and found the perfect spot to set up camp. A flat clearing near the water, shaded by a few tall pines. I pitched my tent, got a small fire going, and set up my little cooking area. After everything was done, I sat on a log by the fire and just listened to the sounds of the woods. The wind, the occasional splash from the lake, the distant hoot of an owl. As the sun started dipping below the trees, I decided to go for a short walk along the lake's edge. The water was calm, reflecting the last light of the day. I followed the shoreline for a bit, taking in the view. That's when I saw the first sign that something was off. About 30 yards ahead, near the tree line, I spotted something on the ground. A backpack. It was old and torn, half buried under some leaves. At first, I thought maybe someone had just forgotten it, but as I got closer, I realized it wasn't just thrown away. It looked like it had been there for years. The fabric was rotting, and the straps were frayed. I nudged it with my boot, and the whole thing just crumbled. Something about it made me uneasy. This wasn't a spot where people camped often, and the fact that it had just been left there without anyone coming back for it was strange. I looked around, but there was nothing else nearby. No tent, no fire pit, no signs that anyone had stayed there. Just that decayed backpack. I told myself it was probably just some old hiker's gear that had been left behind, and I turned back toward my camp. But as I walked, I had this nagging feeling like I was being watched. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing, just trees and shadows. Back at my camp, I got the fire going stronger and made myself some dinner. I tried to shake the feeling from earlier, but it stuck with me. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. The first night was uneventful. I woke up a few times to the sound of animals moving in the brush, but that was normal. The second day, I explored further along the lake, fished for a bit, and just enjoyed the peace. That evening, as I was collecting firewood, I noticed something else. Footprints. Not mine. They were fresh, pressed deep into the dirt, and they led from the tree line toward the lake, then back again. My heart started pounding. I bent down and took a closer look. They weren't boot prints. They were bare feet, the size of a man's, and they were deep like whoever made them was walking with purpose. I scanned the tree line, but I didn't see anything. The sun was setting, and the shadows stretched long across the ground. My gut told me to leave, but I had another night planned, and I didn't want to freak myself out over nothing. I forced myself to act normal, but my mind kept racing. Why would someone be walking around out here barefoot? And why near my camp? I kept the fire bigger that night, hoping it would keep whatever was out there away. I barely slept, lying awake in my tent, listening. Every little sound made me tense up. Sometime after midnight, I heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, right outside my tent. I held my breath, gripping my knife tight. The footsteps stopped. Then, something pressed against the side of my tent. Not hard, just enough to make the fabric bulge inward. I stayed completely still. My heart was pounding so hard I thought whoever was out there would hear it. The pressure stayed for a few seconds, then it was gone. The footsteps moved away, back into the woods. I stayed awake until dawn, knife in hand, listening. When the sun finally came up, I crawled out of the tent, exhausted. There were more footprints in the dirt. Closer this time. Whoever it was had circled my camp. That was it. I wasn't staying another night. I packed up fast, keeping my knife out the entire time. As I slung my backpack over my shoulder, I scanned the tree line one last time. That's when I saw him. He was standing just inside the trees, about 50 feet away. A tall, thin man, completely naked, covered in dirt. His skin was pale, almost gray. His hair was long and matted. He just stood there, staring at me. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. Then, without making a sound, he took a step back, and another, and then he was gone, swallowed by the trees. I didn't stick around. I hiked out of there as fast as I could, barely stopping for a break. When I finally reached my truck, I threw my gear in the back and peeled out of there, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to that lake. I don't know what I saw out there. Maybe just some hermit living off the grid. Maybe something worse. But I still think about those footprints. The way he stood there, just watching. And I wonder how many nights he had been out there, silently circling my camp, waiting. I had been camping alone for years, ever since I was a teenager. My dad used to take me out when I was a kid, and over time, I had learned to love the quiet isolation of the woods. It wasn't just about escaping the noise of the world, but something deeper. An urge to be alone, to rely on myself, to be away from everything for a while. That year, I decided to head out to a remote section of a national forest. It wasn't a marked campsite, just a patch of land far off the beaten path. I had driven miles on an old dirt road, parked where the trees grew too thick to continue, and hiked another few miles in. The place was perfect, silent except for the wind through the trees and the occasional crack of a branch. I set up my tent near a clearing, with a thick tree line on one side and a rocky outcrop on the other. It was late afternoon by the time I had my fire pit ready and my gear set up. I sat by the fire as the sun dipped behind the trees, eating a simple meal and listening to the distant sounds of the forest. The usual rustlings of small animals moving through the underbrush, the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, but then something changed. The sounds stopped, not all at once, but in a way that felt unnatural. The rustling faded first, then the birds. Even the wind seemed to die down. I had been in the woods long enough to know that silence was never a good sign. It meant something was nearby, something big enough that the smaller creatures had gone still. I turned, scanning the dark tree line, but I saw nothing. Still, I felt something, that eerie, unmistakable sensation of being watched. I had no reason to feel uneasy, but I did. I had a rifle, a knife, years of experience in the wilderness, so why did I feel so damn nervous? I tried to shake it off and focused on the fire, keeping my back to the trees, listening carefully. A few minutes passed, and I started to hear movement again, but something was off about it. The sounds weren't normal. They were too slow, too deliberate. I had heard deer moving through the woods plenty of times, but this wasn't a deer. It sounded like something on 2 feet, moving with a heavy, careful step. I stood up and grabbed my rifle. My first thought was a bear, maybe a person, but neither of those explanations felt right. I called out, but of course no one answered. Then I saw it, a shape just barely visible between the trees. Tall, thin, almost human but wrong. Too long in places, too stretched. It stood just at the edge of the firelight, almost blending into the shadows. My heart pounded as I tried to process what I was seeing. I had seen plenty of animals in the wild, but nothing like this. The thing didn't move for a long moment, just stood there, watching. And then, slowly, it took a step forward. The way it moved sent a chill down my spine. Its limbs jerked in an unnatural way, like it wasn't used to them, like it was trying to remember how to walk. My grip tightened on the rifle and I aimed at it, my finger hovering over the trigger. Then it made a noise. It was the worst sound I had ever heard. It wasn't an animal sound. It wasn't even human. It was like something trying to copy human speech but failing, an awful, garbled attempt at making words. It sent a wave of cold dread through me. I had never been superstitious, never believed in anything beyond what I could see. But at that moment, I knew whatever I was looking at wasn't supposed to exist. I fired. The shot rang out through the trees, and the thing jerked back. But it didn't fall. It didn't run. It just stood there, and then it smiled. The firelight flickered, and I saw its face clearer now. It was wrong, too human, but not. The skin was stretched tight over its skull, the eyes too deep, the mouth too wide. The smile looked painful, like it wasn't meant to be there. I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my gear, left the tent behind, and ran. I knew the way back to my truck, knew how to navigate even in the dark. I didn't look back. The whole way, I felt it behind me, heard the heavy footsteps keeping pace, always just beyond the edge of the light. When I reached my truck, I threw my gear in and sped off down the dirt road, not caring about the rough terrain, not stopping until I was miles away. I never went back to that forest, never camped alone again, and sometimes late at night, I still hear that sound, the awful broken attempt at speech, and I wonder if it followed me home. I never liked camping alone, but sometimes it felt necessary. The past few months had been rough, and I needed time to think. That's why I packed my gear and drove out to a forest in Germany, near the Bavarian border. I had camped there once before with a friend, but this time I wanted to be alone.
No distractions.
Just me, the trees, and the rain that was supposed to start later that night. I arrived in the late afternoon, parking my car on a small dirt road leading into the woods. It wasn't an official campsite, just a place I had found years ago that felt secluded enough. I grabbed my backpack, double-checked my supplies, and set off into the trees. The forest was dense but familiar. I followed an old hunting path that curved along a shallow stream, the ground soft and damp from previous rain. The air smelled rich, full of pine and wet soil. After hiking for nearly an hour, I reached the spot I had in mind. It was a small clearing near the base of a hill, surrounded by thick trees that acted as a natural windbreak. I set my pack down and got to work pitching my tent. The sky had turned gray by then, heavy with rain clouds that hadn't started to let loose yet. Once my tent was up, I gathered some dry wood from beneath fallen branches, careful to pick pieces that weren't too damp. I built a small fire, enough to cook dinner and keep warm. I ate in silence, listening to the distant sounds of the forest, birds settling in for the night, the rustling of leaves as the wind picked up. The loneliness felt good at first, peaceful. Then, as I finished my meal, I noticed something odd. The forest had gone quiet, completely silent. No wind, no birds, no insects, just stillness. I looked around, suddenly aware of how alone I was. It was that kind of silence that made your ears ring, the kind that felt unnatural. I had spent enough time outdoors to know that when the forest goes quiet, it usually means a predator is nearby. A wolf, maybe. A wild boar. I glanced at my surroundings, trying to spot movement between the trees. Nothing. Just shadows and branches swaying in the weak light of my fire. The rain started soon after. A light drizzle at first, tapping against the leaves, then gradually turning into a steady downpour. I threw the rest of my firewood onto the flames, knowing it wouldn't last long in the rain. I retreated to my tent, zipping myself inside, listening to the heavy drops against the fabric. Inside, I checked my phone. No signal. I wasn't surprised. I had expected it, but it still made me feel uneasy. I turned off the screen, laid back on my sleeping bag, and listened. That's when I heard it. Footsteps, faint but clear, coming from somewhere beyond the trees. I held my breath, straining to hear over the rain. The steps were slow, deliberate, not the random movement of an animal, but something or someone moving carefully, listening, watching. I told myself it was just paranoia. Rain has a way of distorting sounds, making them seem closer than they are. But then I heard them again, closer this time, just beyond the clearing. I reached for my flashlight and hesitated before turning it on. If someone was out there, I didn't want to give away my exact position. Instead, I stayed still, gripping the handle of my camping knife. The footsteps stopped. Minutes passed. The rain continued, hammering against my tent. I waited, heart pounding, but heard nothing else. Maybe it had been my imagination. Maybe it was just a deer passing through. I told myself that over and over until eventually exhaustion took over. I woke up hours later to a sound that made my blood run cold. The zipper of my tent. It was slow, careful, as if whoever was outside was trying not to wake me. I didn't move, didn't breathe. The zipper went down another inch, then another. I clenched my knife in my fist, every muscle in my body tense. My mind raced through every possible scenario. If it was an animal, it wouldn't be trying to open the tent like that. If it was a person, why weren't they saying anything? Why weren't they using a flashlight? The zipper moved again. I couldn't wait any longer. I lunged forward, shoving my hand against the fabric and shouting as loud as I could. The second my palm hit the tent wall, I heard fast, heavy footsteps. Someone running, crashing through the undergrowth. I ripped open the zipper from the inside and shined my flashlight out into the rain. Nothing, only trees and darkness. I stepped out, knife in one hand, flashlight in the other, scanning the forest. Rain pelted my face, dripping from the branches. The fire had long since gone out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the wet ash. There were footprints in the mud, deep ones, leading from the edge of the clearing to my tent, but no sign of who made them. I stood there for what felt like forever, my breathing shallow, my pulse pounding in my ears. Whoever it was had run off. But what if they came back? I made my decision quickly. I grabbed my backpack, shoved my most important gear inside, and left everything else behind. I wasn't about to spend another minute in that tent, waiting for whoever had been out there to return. I walked fast, almost running, using my flashlight to follow the path I had taken earlier. The rain made it difficult to see, but I didn't stop. I kept moving, forcing myself to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. By the time I reached my car, I was soaked to the bone. I threw my pack inside, locked the doors, and started the engine. The headlights cut through the rain, illuminating the dirt road ahead. That's when I saw them, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, motionless, watching me. I didn't wait to see if they would move. I hit the gas, tires slipping in the mud, and sped down the road as fast as I could without losing control. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town, where I pulled into a gas station and sat in my car, hands shaking, heart racing. I never went back for my tent. I never went back to that forest, and I never camped alone again. I had been camping alone for years. It was something I did every few months, getting out into the woods to clear my head. I was never one for big campgrounds or designated sites. I preferred the quiet of the deep forest, places where the only sounds were the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of wildlife. This time, I had picked a spot farther out than usual, somewhere no one else would be. I had checked the area beforehand on a map, made sure it wasn't on private land, and packed up for a 4-day trip. I was prepared, as I always was, plenty of food, extra water, my rifle, and a good sense of direction. I parked my truck on a dirt road about 2 miles from where I planned to set up camp and hiked the rest of the way in. The trees were thick, mostly pine, with only a few clearings scattered throughout. It was late autumn, the air crisp, the ground covered in fallen needles. The sun was already dropping lower, casting long shadows across the forest floor. I set up my tent near a small creek, not too close in case of rain, but close enough that I could refill my bottles easily. I built a fire, cooked a simple meal, and sat listening to the silence around me. I didn't expect anyone to be out here. That was part of the reason I had chosen this spot. The first night was uneventful. I woke early, boiled water for coffee, and spent the day hiking, scouting the area, getting a feel for the land. I saw deer tracks, the occasional rabbit, and once, In the distance, the dark shape of a black bear moving between the trees paid me no mind. By the time I made it back to camp, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. I gathered more wood, built up the fire, and settled in for another quiet night. That changed on the second night. It was sometime after midnight when I woke up. I wasn't sure what had pulled me from sleep, but I was alert in an instant. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a faint light around the campsite. I listened. First, there was nothing. Then, a sound soft, almost careful, like someone stepping lightly on the forest floor. My first thought was an animal, a deer maybe, or something smaller moving through the trees. But then I heard it again, closer this time. I reached for my rifle, keeping still, straining to hear. The noise had stopped. I waited for several minutes, but there was nothing but silence. I convinced myself it had been my imagination, some trick of half-sleep, and lay back down, though I kept my weapon close. I didn't sleep well. The next morning, I found tracks near my camp. Not animal tracks, boot prints. They circled my tent, stopping just outside the fire's glow. Someone had been watching me. My stomach tightened. I was miles from anyone, or so I had thought. I scanned the tree line, searching for any movement, but saw nothing. Whoever had been there was gone now. Still, the unease stayed with me. I had camped alone more times than I could count, but this was different. I considered packing up and leaving, but decided against it. I had my rifle. I was prepared. Maybe it had been another hiker who had stumbled across my camp and left. It didn't explain why they had walked around my tent without waking me, but I tried not to dwell on that. Instead, I spent the day hunting. I hiked further out than the day before, trying to focus on the woods instead of my growing sense of unease. Every so often, I stopped to listen, checking my surroundings, making sure I was alone. The hours passed, the tension faded, and by the time I returned to camp, I had convinced myself I had overreacted. That changed on the third night. I woke up to the sound of something moving right outside my tent. Not the light, cautious steps of the night before. This was deliberate, slow, close. I gripped my rifle, heart pounding. The fire had burned down again, but there was enough light to see the shadow outside my tent. A shape, person. I sat up, gripping the gun, waiting. The shadow didn't move. It just stood there. I swallowed hard, keeping my breathing steady. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry to leave. My mind raced. Should I call out? Let them know I was armed? I decided against it. Instead, I waited. Finally, after what felt like hours but was likely minutes, the figure moved. Not away, but around the tent. Slow, measured steps. I heard them near the fire pit, then by my pack, then near the creek. Then, nothing. I stayed awake until dawn. When the first light crept through the trees, I stepped outside, rifle raised. There were tracks again, clearer this time. They led from the tree line to my tent around the campsite, then back into the woods. I followed them for a while, but they eventually disappeared into the undergrowth. I didn't see another soul, but I knew then that I wasn't alone. Someone was watching me, playing with me. I packed up immediately. I wasn't going to spend another night out here. I hiked back to my truck faster than I ever had before, checking over my shoulder the entire way. When I reached the road, the relief was overwhelming. I climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and sped off without looking back. It wasn't until I was miles away, back on a main road, that I let myself breathe normally again. Even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been lucky. Someone had been out there, watching me, waiting. I don't know what they wanted, and I don't think I ever will. But I do know one thing. I won't be camping alone again. I never used to think much about fear. It was just something I understood in a distant way, like how a child knows fire is hot without having to touch it. But some things you only learn by experience. Some fears you don't understand until you're out there, in the middle of nowhere with the wrong kind of person watching you. It was late autumn when I decided to go on a solo camping trip. I had done plenty of solo trips before, but this time I wanted to push myself. I chose a spot deeper in the wilderness, far from where most hikers or campers would go. The kind of place where you wouldn't see another person for miles. The area was in Montana, near the Bitterroot National Forest. It was one of those places where you had to drive for hours down old Forest Service roads, then hike even further. I packed enough supplies for 4 days: food, water, extra clothes, my rifle, my knife, and a sturdy tent. My plan was to set up camp by a river I had seen on the map. I liked being near water when I camped. It gave me an easy way to stay clean, refill my bottles, and just listen to the sound of it at night. When I finally reached the river, the place was perfect. The water was clear, running fast over smooth rocks. The trees stretched high above me, their autumn colors making the forest look alive. The air smelled like wet leaves and cold earth. I set up my tent a few yards from the water, made a fire, and cooked a small meal. The first night was peaceful. The only sounds were the river and the occasional rustling in the bushes from small animals moving in the dark. The next morning, I decided to explore. I followed the river downstream for a few miles, just taking in the sights. It was beautiful, but I started noticing strange things. First, I found an old, rusted axe buried in a tree stump. It looked like it had been there for years, but something about it made me uneasy. It wasn't just the rust. It was the way it was wedged into the stump, like someone had left it there in a hurry. A little further down, I found a pile of bones. They were scattered near the riverbank, bleached white from the sun. At first, I thought they were from an animal, but some of them looked too large. I told myself they had to be from a deer or an elk, but my gut told me otherwise. That night, things started feeling different. As I sat by my fire, eating, I had the distinct feeling that I wasn't alone. It wasn't a sound or a movement, it was just a feeling, like something had shifted in the air. I kept looking around, scanning the tree line, but I saw nothing. Then, around midnight, I woke up suddenly. My fire had burned low, just glowing embers now. The river was still running. The night was quiet, but something felt wrong. I listened. At first, I heard nothing unusual. Then, just barely audible over the water, I heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, not an animal. Animals move in bursts, quick and uneven. This was different. Someone was walking near my camp. I reached for my knife and stayed completely still, listening. The footsteps moved closer, then stopped. I held my breath. Whoever it was, they were just outside my tent. I could hear their breathing. And then, after a long moment, they walked away. I stayed awake until morning. As soon as the sun was up, I checked the area around my tent. The ground was damp, so footprints were easy to see. There were deep boot prints leading from the tree line right up to my tent, and then back into the woods. I packed my things. I was done. The hike back felt longer than it should have. Every sound made me jump. The feeling of being watched never left me. I reached my truck by late afternoon. As I threw my gear into the back, I looked down at the dirt road. There were more footprints, fresh ones. Someone had been here recently. Someone had followed me. I got in my truck and left without looking back. I still don't know who was out there with me. I don't know what they wanted. But I know this. I was not alone in those woods. And whoever was out there, they didn't want to be seen. I never went back. I always liked camping. It wasn't about getting away from people or even about nature itself. It was the silence, the kind you don't get in a city. where the hum of cars and distant chatter is always present. Out in the woods, away from everything, I could hear my own thoughts. That's why I kept doing it. I was in my late 30s then, still in decent shape from an active lifestyle, but not the kind of person you'd call a survivalist. I had my routines, my gear, and my spots. This time, I picked a place I had never been to before. It was a national forest in West Virginia, not too far from a small town called Fair Creek. It wasn't a popular hiking destination, which was exactly why I picked it. I parked my truck at a dirt pull-off near a barely visible trailhead. No signs, no markers, just a narrow path leading into the trees. That was a good sign. It meant not many people came out here. I strapped my pack on, adjusted my boots, and headed in. The hike was rough. The trail, if you could even call it that, was overgrown, uneven, and covered in loose rocks. It felt like no one had walked it in years. That should have been a warning, but I ignored it. I wanted isolation. After about 4 miles, I found a decent clearing near a stream. It wasn't big, but it was flat enough for my tent, and I had water nearby. I set up camp, got a fire going, and ate a quick meal. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows through the trees. The air smelled like damp earth and pine. It was perfect. Then, just as the last bit of daylight disappeared, I noticed something. The woods had gone silent. If you've spent enough time outside, you know what that means. There's always some background noise, crickets, birds, the rustling of small animals. But this was different. The silence felt heavy, like the air itself had thickened. I scanned the trees, feeling a knot tighten in my stomach. I wasn't scared yet, but I was aware. I stayed by the fire, listening. Maybe it was just my imagination, or maybe some animal was nearby, waiting for me to go to sleep. I stayed up longer than I planned, just watching the darkness beyond the firelight. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I crawled into my tent. I woke up in the middle of the night. Something had moved outside my tent. I held my breath and listened. A soft crunch, leaves shifting. It wasn't wind. It wasn't small. I reached for my knife. The fire outside had burned low, casting a dim, flickering glow through the thin fabric of the tent. I strained my ears, waiting. Then, just as suddenly as it came, the sound stopped. I waited. Minutes passed. Nothing. Maybe it had been a deer, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. I tried to convince myself of that as I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I stepped outside and checked the ground around my tent. The dirt was soft from recent rain, easy to leave prints in. I expected to see deer tracks, maybe a raccoon's tiny hand-like prints. But what I saw was different.
Bare footprints.
Human. They weren't large, maybe a size 10, but they were deep, like whoever left them had been standing still for a long time. They circled my campsite, stopping just outside my tent. I felt my stomach turn. I was miles from the nearest road. No marked trails led here, and I hadn't seen another person since I parked my truck. I tried to stay rational. Maybe some hiker had gotten lost and stumbled across my camp. Maybe they were just as surprised to see my tent as I was to see their tracks. But why didn't they say anything? Why stand there in the dark, watching my tent? I packed up and moved deeper into the forest. I should have left. I should have hiked straight back to my truck and never looked back. But something in me refused to let this go. I wasn't going to be scared away from a camping trip. I had my knife, a hatchet, and a firearm in my pack. If someone was out here messing with me, they'd regret it. The next site I picked was harder to reach. I had to climb a steep ridge, pushing through thick underbrush. The whole time I felt watched, but every time I turned around, there was nothing but trees. By the time I set up camp, the sun was already setting. I built my fire bigger than before, keeping my back to a rock face. At least this way, nothing could sneak up behind me. The night dragged on. I forced myself to stay awake, staring into the darkness, listening. Hours passed. Nothing. Then, sometime past midnight, I heard it again. A single step. Not an animal. Not wind. Something heavier. I didn't move. I barely breathed. Then, another step. It was slow, deliberate, like whoever it was didn't want to be heard. I gripped my knife, my pulse hammering. Then silence. I waited. 5 minutes. 10. 20. Nothing. Finally, I forced myself to relax, telling myself I was overreacting. But just as I was about to turn in, something hit my tent. Not hard, just a light tap, like a hand pressing against the fabric. I shot up, yanking my knife free. The fire cast enough light to see the shape outside. Tall, still. I lunged out, weapon ready, but there was nothing there. Just the trees. The ground where the figure had stood was undisturbed.
No prints.
No sign that anyone had ever been there. That was enough for me. I packed my gear in record time and hiked back through the night. I didn't stop. I didn't rest. Every step, I expected to hear something behind me, but the forest stayed silent. When I reached my truck at dawn, I locked the doors and sat there, gripping the steering wheel until my hands stopped shaking. I never went back to that forest. I never even looked it up again. Whatever was out there, it didn't want me there, and I wasn't about to find out why.